Zoe spent the last 2 months before giving birth at her mother's. She wanted to return home, but her husband responded angrily and became irritated every time he saw a large belly. Her beloved's coldness and indifference hurt, though she found him justified in the pain of losing a loved one. When they first got married, they decided to live with her mother-in-law. Mrs. Lewis had long been widowed, and while her son lived in a dormitory during his college years, she was alone all the time. The 5-room flat, inherited from her grandfather, was empty. Her mother-in-law never complained, but Zoe could see how lonely and difficult her life was. So, after the wedding, she asked if they could live in a spare room for a while. Mrs. Lewis blossomed before us. She happily invited her son and daughter-in-law to her place. She allowed them to make repairs and do whatever they wanted, except her room. It was where she had lived happily for years with her now deceased husband. Her mother-in-law proved to be an excellent neighbor and a sensitive companion. She never clashed with the young men, helping with the cooking and cleaning. Zoe quickly found common ground with her. Mrs. Lewis had become like a second mother to her, to whom she could always come for advice and help. Her mother-in-law was the first person she told about her pregnancy. Mrs. Lewis smiled and whirled her daughter-in-law into a dance. Then Zoe decided to make Kit happy when he came home from work. "Is it true?" Kit shrieked. "Yes," smiled Zoe happily. "You're going to be a father soon." "That's great," Kit shouted, picking up his wife and spinning her around the room, then kissing his mother on both cheeks. Her husband rejoiced so exuberantly that Zoe herself blossomed. Kit surrounded her with care, bought her expensive food, took her to the cinema, and to walks in the park. Mrs. Lewis offered to prepare one of the rooms for renovation, which the son and daughter-in-law enthusiastically did. Mother-in-law always kept Zoe's favorite sweets in the house, monitored the girl's diet, and personally brewed her healthy herbal tea. Together with Zoe, they thought up the nursery design and looked at clothes and toys in children's shops. Kit couldn't go to the first ultrasound because of a heavy workload, but her mother-in-law happily agreed to support her. They made their way to the room together, and then, with bated breath, they looked at the gray lump on the screen of the machine. Printed pictures of the baby quickly sprawled across the wall of the flat, the fridge, and the frames. Now Kit carried one printout with him and proudly showed it to all his colleagues and friends. The daddy-to-be planned football games, hunting trips, and other useful things he would do with his son. "But maybe it would be a girl," Zoe once said. "It can't," her husband shook his head. "I can only have a son." "What if it's a girl?" asked his wife. "Then you better not have one at all." Kit went about his business, but Zoe was still sitting in the kitchen, digesting what had been said. Mrs. Lewis, who had come in for tea, sensed at once that something was wrong, questioned the mother-to-be about what had happened, and then went off to have a serious talk with her son. Zoe didn't know what was going on behind closed doors, but she could hear indecipherable shouting, and then her mother-in-law returned. She somehow became old and drab all at once, smiling sadly, and said that there was still time, and Kit could accept his baby regardless of the gender. The next day, after Mrs. Lewis had gone to the supermarket, Zoe received a call from the hospital. Her mother-in-law became ill and collapsed right in the middle of the shopping hall. The frightened son and daughter-in-law immediately went there. The doctor upset them. It turned out that Mrs. Lewis's health was not as good as it seemed. How long she had left was unknown. The pregnancy took a back seat. Kit fussed around his mom. Zoe also tried to stay close to the woman, giving her maximum attention. She went to the second ultrasound alone. Her husband decided not to take any time off from work, while Mrs. Lewis was not feeling well enough for a long walk. The doctor was scrutinizing the baby on the screen, and suddenly the girl froze in fear when it came time to announce the sex of the baby. 98% it's a girl," said the doctor cheerfully. "I congratulate you. You will soon have a little princess." The woman smiled and said something else, but Zoe could not hear her anymore. It was a shock for the mother-to-be. She was terrified of how to tell her husband the news. The girl came home as pale as death. Her mother-in-law understood everything at once, sat her on the sofa, offered tea, and said that she would definitely be there for her and would support her. Then she started to talk about her pregnancy, how she dreamed of a girl, and how she cried when a boy was born, and how happy she had been to watch her son grow. In the evening, Kit discovered the idle scene in the kitchen. The women had again cooked a festive dinner. It suggested to the man that his dream had come true. He joked merrily and enjoyed his dinner without noticing the thickening tension. "So, what are we going to name our son?" husband asked Zoe. Silence prevailed, and the girl turned pale to the point where she was no different from the kitchen wall. Mrs. Lewis wiped her lips with a napkin and began from afar. "You know, when I was pregnant, we didn't have ultrasounds. I walked around for 9 months with the certainty that I was having a girl. When you were born, I was disappointed, but once I took such a good little baby in my arms, gender didn't matter. You'll love your baby, too, as soon as you see it for the first time." "You mean—" Kit threw his fork on the table with a clink and continued through gritted teeth. "You mean it's a girl?" Zoe squinted frightenedly, and her mother-in-law nodded quite calmly. "A girl, isn't it great? Girls always love their dads more than boys." But that argument didn't sit well with the father-to-be. Kit was really going off the rails. He shouted that a real man could only have a son, that girls are useless and worthless. There were many more hurtful words and accusations. Zoe burst into tears. Mrs. Lewis had a big fight with her son, but she couldn't change his mind. Kit left the house, slamming the door loudly. "It's all right. Give him some time. He'll calm down," sadly the mother-in-law said. But the more time passed, the worse the situation became. The husband turned into a cold block of ice. He was not interested in his wife's well-being, and in general, the man paid no attention to Zoe, and began to live in a separate room. Sometimes he exchanged a few words with his mother, but he didn't even try to speak with his wife. The girl could not stand such an attitude. One day, when her husband was at work, she packed her things. Mrs. Lewis appeared unnoticed in the room, silently helped her put her shoes in the bag, carried her bags into the hallway, and then called her daughter-in-law into her room. "I don't understand or condone my son's behavior," she said. "I hope he gets his mind right before the girl is born, and you do as you feel comfortable. Just promise me that when the baby is born, you'll put this on her arm." Mrs. Lewis took a fine silver bracelet from her hand and handed it to her daughter-in-law, and she looked involuntarily at her mother-in-law's birthmark, which looked like a star. "I don't ask the baby to wear it. Put it on when they give her to you in the maternity ward, and then take it off in a couple of hours. It's a family tradition. Give the bracelet to your granddaughter when she grows up. It's been in the family for centuries." "Okay," Zoe nodded, surprised. "You can do that yourself. I was going to ask you to come with me to the maternity ward." "I don't think so, honey," she sighed sadly. "But I'll try." Zoe went to her mother's house, where she lived for several months, calling her mother-in-law almost every day. The woman's voice seemed to grow weaker and weaker, but she assured her that everything was all right. One day, Zoe received a phone call with terrible news. Mrs. Lewis was gone. It was a couple of weeks before Zoe's daughter was born. She wept for days. She went to the funeral, but then she became ill and asked her parents to take her home. Kit refused to go near to his wife. On the eve of the drive to the maternity hospital, the girl could not sleep. The bag had been packed a long time ago, but some thought kept haunting her, as if she'd forgotten something important. Zoe went over the list of the essentials, but everything was there. Then it hit her. She had forgotten the bracelet her mother-in-law had left her during their last meeting. She put it on her hand just in case, and then, as if on cue, contractions started. Zoe was taken by ambulance to the hospital, and the labor was difficult. Half awake from the pain, the girl thought her mother-in-law was standing nearby, stroking her head, holding her hand. But as soon as Zoe looked around, no one she knew was there. After a few hours, an adorable little angel was born. The baby frowned funny and squeaked amusingly. Zoe cradled her reverently. Her gaze fell on her mother-in-law's bracelet. She hastily removed it from her hand and put it on the tiny hand. She and her daughter were taken to the general ward and left alone. Soon, the doctors reappeared, and Zoe, as her mother-in-law had said, hid the bracelet. The baby was then examined and tested on the APGAR score. "Look, how interesting," said the neonatologist to a colleague. "The baby has a birthmark on its arm. I've never seen that before." "Strange. I thought there was nothing there before," frowned the woman. Zoe perked up. She waited impatiently for her daughter to be handed over and peered at the small hand, and there was indeed a small dark spot in the shape of a star. The little girl wiggled unhappily in her mother's arms and then stared at her with painfully familiar eyes. "Well, Mommy, have you thought of a name for your daughter yet?" the doctor asked. "Angela," Zoe smiled. That was Mrs. Lewis's name. Kit did not react at all to the news of the birth of his daughter. He didn't come to the maternity hospital, and Zoe was desperate when she was discharged, but she wasn't going to give up. Angela, sleeping sweetly, went to the pram, which Zoe resolutely wheeled towards the familiar apartment. The door was locked for a long time, and then the lock clicked, and a disgruntled husband appeared on the threshold. "What do you want?" he asked glumly. "I've come to introduce you to my daughter." Zoe determinedly pushed Kit off the threshold and stepped inside. Ignoring the man, she went into her mother-in-law's room and laid the baby in the bed. Angela sighed peacefully and sniffled. "What are you doing here?" The husband got angry. "This is my mother's room. Put that away now. What is it?" Kit moved closer to the bed and stared at the baby's arm. The birthmark was painfully familiar. The man knelt down in front of the baby, took the little palm in his hand, and burst into tears. After this, he accepted his daughter, and Zoe returned home. Relationships in this family had improved again, and Kit proved to be a loving father. Looking at them with their growing daughter, Zoe often thought that they were two soulmates who, no matter what, always stayed together. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.